The defining feature of the modern world is the death of God. And you can see that follow up not only in the announcement of Nietzsche himself, but also in the works of the postmodernists, who are characterized as being skeptical towards meta-narratives. And what that essentially means is that not only is any particular truth undermined, but the idea of the truth is undermined. So, at the various stages through history, there have of course been different paradigms of truth. But now, since the suffusion through society of science, it has become impossible to believe in any objective notion of the truth. So in the place of objective truth, we have a sort of notion of a new God, although we have Nietzsche, who announced the death of God, and he says there will be no new gods. But at the same time, he does sort of generate for himself a myth. It's just a new class of myth. In a sense, you could say that he does attempt to fill that God-shaped hole in his own soul, but he also does try, and he doesn't just give up, right? He's not a nihilist. So the idea of the death of God, first of all, inspires nihilism. If nothing is true, if nothing can possibly have any real meaning, if there's no future goal to work towards, it inspires a sense of drifting meaninglessly into a hedonistic, purposeless life. But of course, Nietzsche was not into that sort of idea. He was very much a life-affirming philosopher, or at least desperately clamoured towards the affirmation of life. So his myth that he constructed in the place of objective truth is the notion of the eternal recurrence. So he has the idea that if at the end of your life, instead of dying for eternity, your consciousness completely ceasing to exist, or any other myth, perhaps it's a Buddhist, Hindu one, where you are reconciled with the external world, or a Christian one where you get to live life in heaven. Instead of that, when you die, you are transported right back to the beginning of your life, and you have to live it over and over again exactly the way it was lived. And the idea of that myth is that if it were true, it would demand you to live the best version of your to use a Heideggerian term, own most potentiality for being. It would inspire you to live towards that, because you know that you would have to live it over and over and over again. And of course that would really drain on if you weren't living the perfect possible life. However, if you did live it in the most perfect, constructive, meaningful way, then the idea of being sent back to the beginning of life wouldn't be a burden, it would be a gift. So, that's Nietzsche's myth. And I want to contrast that to Hegel. And I think Hegel, where he preceded Nietzsche by one generation of the philosophers. He was contemporary with Schopenhauer, who was Nietzsche's primary inspiration. And I think that the direction between Schopenhauer and Hegel has largely dictated the progression of philosophy since the time of their lives. I mean, that naturally makes sense considering the fact that there was the French Revolution not too long before those two philosophers. So it was a time of that was really the sort of nail in the coffin of the religious attitude. Once you had the French Revolution, feudalism died, the whole idea of a king died. Or at least was no longer entirely believable. So we have Hegel, and his myth is this idea of historical dialectic. So I just want to emphasize the fact that he came around the same time that Nietzsche was there, and Nietzsche had already announced the death of God. And so there's this sort of yearning in the human spirit for something, some kind of meaning, and it can't be the traditional notion of meaning. So Hegel's myth is sort of something that he put there as a justification. He tried to fill the God-shaped hole in his own soul, just as Nietzsche did with his eternal recurrence, except, as I'll try and explain, I think that Nietzsche's myth is an entirely self-sufficient one. So it doesn't really pass the buck for the responsibility for your own life onto anyone else. It's entirely up to you. whereas Hegel's philosophy, his myth that he implants in the space left by God, is one that passes the buck to history, fundamentally. So he has the idea of historical dialectic, where history moves through various stages and gradually forms. There are new stages of thought which dictate the functioning of society and the type of events, mental events that happen in the minds of the population, and that certain eras are defined by a certain idea, a certain way of looking at the world. You could say that our era is in a lot of ways a Christian era. But perhaps on a smaller scale, you could say there's various sets of ideas that have happened even within there. For instance, the Renaissance is different to the Europe of Charlemagne, say, or when during the time of the Crusades and the Muslim expansion, you had people like Thomas Aquinas showing up, who that's clearly a distinct stage in Western culture, even in the Christian tradition. So there's sub-stages as well as larger scale stages. But the argument that I really want to make is that for Hegel, he's performing a kind of alchemy on history. So he has the analogy I'm trying to make here is that history for Hegel is the alchemical substance, and that as history progresses, it progresses towards the opus, the magnum opus, which is the lapis philosophorum in alchemy. So as time goes on, you have this prima materia, this basic substance, which the alchemists would use, and they would try and do various operations on it. They'd try and bring it to a higher state. There's a dictum, solve et coagulam, which means dissolve and coagulate. And the idea there is that you have some kind of moderate, not pure substance, and you try and dissolve so you get away all of the excess crap, and then you coagulate so that you can try and have a purified, pure substance. And then once you have that, you can dissolve it again, and you get rid of the other spoiled parts of it. And if you repeat this process over and over again, eventually you come to a perfect, entirely pure substance. And that's what they consider the lapis philosophorum. And it's sort of a synthesis of matter and spirit. So if you imagine, instead of the substance inside of the alchemist's retort, you have history, and it's being directed by some unknown force. For Hegel, that force would probably be God, and it's going through these multiple stages, and it's heading towards some kind of ultimate crystallization of the idea. So for Hegel, that would be sort of the state. The state is the crystallization of the idea. He says something like the state is the ultimate manifestation of the idea of God on earth. So I think that's parallel clearly to Christ. Christ is the Word made flesh, or the God made flesh. So for Hegel, it's the state at the end of the historical dialectic. That is the manifestation of the idea on earth. But yeah, so what we end up here with Hegel is he makes a mistake, I think, in this reasoning, because he ends up with the state being the analogue of the alchemical opus, whereas for the alchemists, the opus was really more parallel with Christ. Once the synthesis of matter and spirit resulted in Christ rather than some social organization. And I think because Hegel thinks of the perfected idea, the end of the alchemical process, as being a system of social organization, that is largely to blame for the ideologies and systems that we see, philosophical ideas that we see in the modern world, because a lot of them base themselves off Hegel. And I think at the end of the day, Hegel's a statist. He doesn't believe that the ultimate truth, or that the opus, or that Christ is a psychological phenomenon. He believes it's a social phenomenon, which means that if we want to get to the perfect world, for anyone who is just descendant of Hegel, we must, the area that we have to actually perform the operations to get there is on the social level, as opposed to someone like Nietzsche or Jung, where the level, or the alchemist, the level is on the personal psychological level. So yeah, so we got Hegel as describing history. History itself would be the alchemical substance. Now, along from that, I would say that the difference between Hegel and Nietzsche here is that Nietzsche would be the alchemist. Hegel would consider himself merely a part of the alchemical substance being operated upon by God, whereas Nietzsche would see himself as the one doing the operating. Nietzsche was attempting to create a bridge to the Superman, the ubermensch, which is essentially someone who is an alchemist who could create himself. There's the same sort of ambition that the alchemists have. They want magical powers, not necessarily magical. We can, obviously the alchemists themselves were interested in magical powers, but if we take a Jungian psychological approach to alchemy, we can say that the alchemists were out for some kind of mystical new skill outside of the realm of the typical world. And Nietzsche was trying to direct it. He was the one who was performing the operations. He would delve into his own psychology, and he was trying to find things, move things around, build himself as an alchemist builds the opus. So, just to emphasize, the stuff of the transformation for Nietzsche is the soul, or the mind, right? So he's looking into his own mind, and he's performing operations on his own soul. And he's trying to build his soul, direct the development of his soul. If you were to describe that in Jungian terms, you might say that he was looking inside of himself to the archetypes and then trying to direct the archetypes to his own ends. And that's the idea. That's why the idea of the ubermensch is so ambitious, because it means not only the archetypes are parallel to the gods. So to be an ubermensch is not only to become a god yourself, but to direct the gods to your own desires, to your own intentions, I should say. In Nietzsche, he speaks constantly of his acquaintance with the god Dionysus, who was the god of chaos. Now, I mentioned the dictum solve et coagulam, dissolve and coagulate. Dionysus would be the agent of dissolution, and Apollo would be the agent of coagulation. So Dionysus is the god of revelry, of wine. He's the trickster figure. He's chaos. He's novelty. He's raw energy, whereas Apollo is the dream god. He's a god of cultivation. You might say that when the Greek sculptor looked at his stone and he saw inside of it a perfect sculpture, it was Apollo who sent him the image of the sculpture. Whereas when the musician is overcome with a intense spiritual ecstasy and expresses that through intense music, that would be possession by Dionysus. So for Nietzsche, he was perpetually trying to acquaint himself with Dionysus, and of course this caused him a lot of suffering, and you might argue eventually shattered his mind, but it did give him a good image. It put him in a situation where, now I don't think Nietzsche's correct here, but I think it put him in a situation where he was the one who was responsible for the future. He saw that the god was dead, and he didn't pass the buck for explaining or filling that hole to anyone but himself. He took perfect responsibility for it, because he knew that he was the one who was alive, and that the results of his philosophy matter to no one really except for himself. Fundamentally, if he can't make a philosophy that fits his own life, it's pointless. It's just a intellectual laboring. So the idea of the ubermensch then is kind of like some super Christ, because in the alchemical process, the idea was, in classical alchemy, was the lapis philosophorum was the end goal. The magnum opus was the lapis philosophorum, which is parallel to Christ. It is the synthesis of mind and matter, of consciousness, of the ego, and God, say. There is some mystical union between two totally irreconcilable parts of the whole, and Christ is that synthesis. And the Ubermensch, of course, would also be that, but it would be a synthesis beyond, at a stage beyond the world wherein there is no God. So we're not here in a world where We can believe in any truth. We are beyond that. We have to form a new myth. We have to fill that God-shaped hole, and Nietzsche fills it with the ubermensch. And the ubermensch is this notion of the person, the individual who is capable of directing the gods. Christ himself was not someone who was considered to direct the gods, but to synthesize God and man. Now, the new stage is even more challenging, intensely more challenging than the Christian challenge, which itself is immense. Very few people have actually ventured to perform the Christian task, which involves very strict renunciation. Really, the only Christians are the monks, in my view at least, because they're the ones who really have the Christian experience, as opposed to just reading the books and following the stories. So yeah, I would say Hegel is more of a constituent of the alchemical process of history. He believes that history is undergoing some dialectic which results eventually in the magnum opus, which he identifies with the state, whereas Nietzsche is performing a similar process, except it's on psychology, and there is a magnum opus that is eventually arrived at by people heading towards the ubermensch. But that ultimate state is not the state. It's something that happens in the psyches, in the individual minds of the people he could qualify as the ubermensch. So yes, I would say that here we are at a stage in history where God is dead, we have a God-shaped hole in our soul, and in effect, Hegel has claimed and argued that the ultimate resolution to this situation is to be found in the state, whereas for Nietzsche, the resolution, the lapis, the magnum opus, is to be found in the psyches of individuals, rather than in some form of external social structure.